This video is made possible thanks to InVideo AI. More details coming up soon. A little more than a week ago, on the night of October 1st, the Iranian Ayatollah regime made all the international headlines with a huge ballistic missile launch against Israel. They aimed to attack these targets you see on the screen. I am sure we all saw the impressive images that this attack left us with, even though, fortunately, it had practically no consequences in terms of material damage or human lives. Nevertheless, the Ayatollahs regime is not the only one that has dared to bomb Israel. And no, this time we're referring neither to Hezbollah nor to Hamas. This time we're talking about a group that is usually overlooked but could prove to be tremendously problematic for the West and very beneficial to Tehran's interests. I'm talking about the Houthis, the group that controls a large part of Yemen, a country located at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, a group that has already given us news headlines like these.
Ballistic missile fired by Yemen's Houthis hits Israel, sparking fire. Yemen's Houthis claim drone attack on vital target in central Israel.
But let's be honest, this group that already controls a third of all of Yemen, including the capital, and rules over 2/3 of its population, is not particularly noted for its ability to directly harm Israel. Yes, it's true, from time to time they have launched some missile or drone against them, but the damage has always been minimal. These kinds of attacks are more propaganda than reality. And the reason is that, because, among other things, the trajectory is complicated. Yemenis can launch a missile or a drone, but it has to fly over the skies of Saudi Arabia, a country with which the Houthis are at war. Jordan's skies, which basically protect Israel, if for no other reason than to guarantee water, gas, and intelligence information be passed to them by the Jewish country. And finally, the Yemeni devices would have to overcome the Iron Dome and the rest of Israel's anti-aircraft systems. The result? That a missile or drone launched from Yemen against Israel carries less danger than traveling to Dubai without an umbrella. However, wait a minute, because the Houthis' ability to directly bomb Israel is not exactly what matters to the Iranian regime. This is already taken care of by its armed wing in Lebanon, Hezbollah, an organization which we've already talked about at length here on VisualPolitik. But then, what exactly is it about this Yemeni group that interests the Iranian regime, and why are we talking about them today on this channel? Well, you see, right now, Iran is waiting to see what the promised Israeli response following the missile strike will ultimately look like. As we've already told you on this channel, this is likely to be a measured response that avoids a full escalation of the conflict. But of course, that's only a hypothesis. When it comes down to it, anything could happen. In fact, more than a few analysts claim that Israel has decided that this time its response will be rather forceful. And the point is that, if that does eventuate, there are many questions that have been put on the table. How could Iran deter Israel from a major action? And if despite that, Israel gets out of hand, how could Iran respond without unleashing an all-out war? That is, without immolating itself along the way by launching a massive missile barrage against Israel, or against the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, or the Emirates, which has basically been Tehran's deterrent strategy in recent years. Well, VisualPolitik community, this is where the Houthis could come into play. Taking advantage of its geographical location, this Yemeni group could participate alongside Iran in a campaign capable of causing enormous damage to the global economy. And even if Tehran were to lose its way and wanted to go all out, the Houthis could also be of great help to them in unleashing a devastating action against the world economy. But what actions are we referring to exactly? How important are the Houthis? How can they be of help to the Ayatollahs? And what role do they play in this whole story? Well, let's take a look. But before, as someone who's been creating YouTube videos for absolutely years, I can tell you that a lot happens behind the scenes. Recently, we discovered a tool that has transformed how we make videos, InVideo AI, soon launching its newest version, InVideo AI V3. InVideo AI V3 isn't just any update. It comes with powerful generative capabilities, allowing you to create full-length videos from scratch using simple text prompts, whether it's telling a captivating story, making an educational video, or creating imaginative and stunning visuals. The possibilities are endless. InVideo AI V3 puts you in the director's seat, letting you bring any idea to life. Let me show you an example of what it can do. Simply ask InVideo to create a 1-minute video of the story of a robot in a cyberpunk setting that wants to escape the Matrix.
In the neon-lit labyrinth of Neo Tokyo, a city where the line between man and
But
machine.
it doesn't stop there. In video AI V3's generative media can create anything you can think of, from dramatic storylines to product ads, educational content, and more. Unlike other tools, in video AI V3 is launching within just a few weeks for everyone to use, with features like voice cloning to narrate videos in your voice. In video AI V3 truly stands out as the ultimate video creation tool. And here's the best part. By using the link in the description, pinned comment, or scanning the QR code, you can try InVideo AI V2 for free and create up to 4 videos with a watermark. To unlock the full potential, it's just $20 a month. Use our exclusive code VisualPolitik50 to double your video creation credits in the first month.
Commercial clamp.
Iran is already planning its next move. The regime's leaders have assumed that Israel's response will come sooner rather than later. It's not yet known when or how strong it will be, but it's almost certain that there will be a response. And faced with such a scenario, Tehran is moving to try to cool the tone of the Israeli response as much as possible. How are they doing it? By threatening to respond even more forcefully.
Iranian FM pledges stronger retaliation if Israel strikes Iran.
And of course, given these warnings, the question is very clear. What might that Iranian response look like? Well, it turns out there are possibilities for all tastes. For example, the Iranians could launch another, much larger missile strike against Israel, even one that is capable of saturating anti-aircraft systems and causing real damage. Or they could increase arms deliveries to their Lebanese allies and directly assist Hezbollah so that the organization could carry out more attacks against Israel or Israeli troops in Lebanon in order to cause as many casualties as possible. Another possibility would be to try to help Hezbollah or even Hamas so that either of these two organizations could attack Israel's very important natural gas infrastructure, including the Leviathan and Tamar extraction platforms. And let me tell you, that would cause a great deal of pain to the Israeli economy. However, there's also another possibility, one that would not consist of a direct attack on Israel, but would have such serious consequences that it could force the West to take a stand, not only against Iran, but even with Israel itself. Any idea what we're talking about? Well, we're referring to the fact that Iran could make one of its most famous threats in recent years come true. Close the Strait of Hormuz, in whole or in part. This strait, which lies between Iran, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, is not just another geographical point. No, this is by far the most important and sensitive point for oil supply worldwide. Through this narrow waterway, which is barely 39 kilometers at its narrowest point, passes the vast majority of the barrels of crude oil and the liquefied natural gas tankers exported by the large petrostates of the Persian Gulf, such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and of course, Iran itself. To give you an idea of how important this strait is, between 17 and 21 million barrels of oil have passed through here every day in recent years. Do you know what this means? That around 20% of the entire international crude oil supply passes through this strait. And that's without mentioning liquefied natural gas. Because as we've already told you several times here on VisualPolitik, Qatar is one of the world's largest exporters. And of course, its large methane tankers also pass through this sensitive place. In other words, we're talking about one of the most important arteries of the global economy, if not the most important of all. If the Strait of Hormuz were even partially paralyzed, the damage to the world economy could be devastating. In that scenario, we'd be talking about a huge crisis. Can you imagine how Iran's partial, let alone complete, closure of this strait could affect the global economy? Energy prices would skyrocket, as would prices for food, goods, and transportation. All prices would go into the stratosphere. Do you think gasoline was expensive? Well, watch out if Iran were to make this move. But okay, I can imagine that many of you are thinking, could Iran really do this? Does it have the capacity to close the Strait of Hormuz on its own? Well, yes and no. Let me explain. In general, Iran's fleet is not particularly noted for its power. It's true that in recent years, they've made a great effort to develop torpedoes and fast boats, in some cases unmanned, to be able to attack ships transiting these waters if necessary. They also have some 20 or so submarines. All this capability, along with its stockpile of land-based ballistic missiles, the largest arsenal in the Middle East, could be a real thorn in their side. Iran could attack and sink many tankers and LNG tankers. It could temporarily disrupt traffic in these waters, waters. It could force other Arab countries and Western powers to establish protected convoys, limiting the amount of oil and gas that could pass through. But despite this, going against fleets like that of the United States, the Iranian Navy wouldn't have any capacity for success. They could create nuisance for a few days, but little else. That said, the point is that that's not all they could do.
Iran has another asset that could prove to be a much more difficult challenge to manage: its underwater mines. Although they aren't very sophisticated or new, there are a lot of them. In fact, it's estimated that it has more than 5,000 types of underwater mines, which could be a real problem for the West. On the one hand, because demining operations are extremely costly and time-consuming, and on the other hand, because however old many of these mines may be, the ability to open holes in the hulls of ships still poses a huge risk. In this way, Tehran could clearly, or even by faking an accident, drop a huge number of mines in these waters. That would slow down oil traffic considerably.
So you see, Iran has significant assets that could seriously damage world energy security. In fact, this is one of its greatest deterrents. Any attempt to fully or partially close the Strait of Hormuz could set off a huge economic earthquake. It's true that the Iranian regime would also lose a lot, because they themselves would have problems moving crude oil on which they are very dependent. This could lead them to opt for a partial shutdown. That is, attacking many of the vessels that traverse these waters. The risk is real. But VisualPolitik community, what if I told you that blocking Hormuz would be only half of this strategy? What if I told you that Iran could try to block another strait farther away from its territory at the same time? What if I told you that the Iranian campaign could consist of creating a kind of commercial clamp? Well, this is exactly where the Houthis could come in. You see, the Houthis control the entire western part of Yemen, which means one thing: the Houthis can heavily hinder the flow of trade in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the two gateways to the Red Sea, and this is no mean feat. If the Strait of Hormuz is crucial for the global oil trade, the Bab el-Mandeb is crucial for all trade in general. Not only does 10% of the world's oil trade pass through this strait, but also up to 15% of the world's maritime trade. Well, can you imagine what would happen if the Houthis intensified their attacks and used Iranian weapons and equipment to try to stop the transit of ships? In all likelihood, we'll see many prices skyrocket again. And keep in mind, this scenario is not a crazy hypothesis. This is something the Houthis are already doing. Right here on VisualPolitik, we already told you how this Yemeni group started attacking cargo ships as early as November 2023, which has already had great effects on the global economy. Major shipping companies such as Denmark's Maersk, China's COSCO, and even BP, the oil giant, have chosen to avoid transiting the Red Sea and crossing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait as much as possible. The risks are too high, and so is the cost of insurance when following that route. So many shipping lines came to the conclusion that it was more economical to take the longer route around Africa and past the Cape of Good Hope than to go through the Red Sea, which is what explains news items like this one from the beginning of October.
Red Sea trade sees historic decline amid rising tensions in Middle East. Red Sea's ship traffic falls 56% as vessels reroute around Cape of Good Hope following retaliatory attacks by Houthis.
Of course, this is something that's already having an impact on prices throughout the supply chain. And remember, that result was achieved with attacking only a few ships very sporadically. If they got their act together, the damage could be much greater and much more lasting. Now, does a non-state terrorist group like the Houthis really have enough power to close the strait? Well, most likely not to close it, but they do have the power to make the risks and costs of passing through the strait so high that no one would want to pass through it. With their arsenal of anti-ship cruise missiles, such as the Al-Mandab 2, Sayad or Sajil, and their Asif, Tankil, and Falek anti-ship ballistic missiles, the Houthis have the capacity to become a more than credible threat to any ship that dares to pass through the waters we're talking about. So, you see, Iran could do great damage to the world economy. Create a sort of clamp effect by partially closing both the Strait of Hormuz and using the Houthis to block the Bab el-Mandeb. We're talking about a blow that would jeopardize the stability of the entire supply chain of the planet. But of course, we can't fool ourselves either. This would be a very risky move, even if they wanted to dress it up with a certain informality. That is, an accident with sea mines scattered here, and an attack by uncontrolled paramilitaries there. But why do we say it would be a risky coup? Well, let's see. Think about it for a moment. How do you think the great world powers would react? It's pretty obvious that they wouldn't react too well. Indeed, many analysts do not rule out a massive international intervention in such a case. But what would such an intervention look like? What challenges would it face? Could it escalate into a major global conflict? Well, pay attention.
a forceful response.
I don't know if you remember, but earlier this year, we came across this news item.
US and UK carry out strikes against Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen.
Faced with the Houthi attacks on merchant ships and cargo vessels that we told you about a moment ago, the West didn't hesitate to give a direct response. It began bombing targets of the Yemeni terrorist group. Let's just say that the West began to flex its muscle in the Red Sea with Operation Prosperity Guardian. Comprising an alliance of up to 20 countries and led by the United States and the United Kingdom, this operation focused on protecting maritime trade in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. To do this job, the international coalition launched a series of coordinated strikes against the Houthis. US and UK air forces, supported by submarines and warships from other allied countries, struck 60 key Houthi targets. These targets included ammunition depots, radar centers, missile launchers, and other infrastructure that the Houthis had used to attack commercial vessels. The objective of the operation was therefore clear: to drastically reduce the offensive capability of the Houthis, to ensure free passage in these waters, and at the same time, to send a clear message to Iran. Since then, the attacks have continued month after month. In fact, earlier this October, the US once again bombed facilities in Yemen. Of course, so far, Washington has been reluctant to get fully involved in this threat, which is why, despite the punitive operations, the Houthis remain such a risk that many ships prefer, as we said earlier, to skirt the entire African continent. Logically, Washington doesn't want to get involved in such a hornet's nest. In Tehran, they know this, and believe that this could be enough for the White House to pull the reins on the Netanyahu government. This is more or less the game that is being played these days. Even so, just in case things do escalate, the United States has moved a huge fleet to the area, including the Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt carrier battle groups, a huge combat capability to which has been added the presence in the area of its 9th Air Wing, which has enormous firepower with its F-18 and F-35 fighter jets. And that's not all. Keep in mind that the United States also has numerous bases throughout the Middle East, on the coasts of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and in Qatar itself, in the Strait of Hormuz, and also in the African nation of Djibouti, which is the country on the other side of Yemen in this very important strait. So what does all this mean? Well, the US could easily launch attacks against any attempt to block both crossings. And not only that, faced with a tremendous threat posed by the blockade of the straits, it's very likely that the United States would not be alone. Without going any further, in Djibouti itself, there is not only the permanent US base, Camp Lemonnier, but also bases of other Western allies, such as France, Japan, and Italy. And there is also one other base of another country to which the blockade of the strait would be fatal. I'm of course talking about China, which would see how one of the most important passages for its exports of products to the rest of the world would be restricted. We're talking about the fact that 40% of all its trade with the European Union, by far its largest trading partner, passes through this strait at the gates of the Red Sea. And here is a curious paradox. China considers Iran a close ally, but the threat of closing the way to its goods or causing a huge global energy crisis is not something that Beijing has been particularly fond of. Even more so when it's also one of the most significant recipients of the oil that crosses these waters. In fact, in the first half of 2023, China was the main recipient of all the oil passing through this strait, about 30% of the total. So it would not be surprising if China, which already has the world's largest navy, could send some of its latest aircraft carriers, some of its 36 destroyers, or some of its 52 combat vessels to bring order. Don't you think that countries like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates would have more than enough reason to jump into the fray as well? And it's not unreasonable to think that Saudi Arabia could intervene by bombing with its Eurofighter Typhoon fighters or with its F-15 fighters. Don't forget that the Saudis have 210 F-15s, the second largest fleet of this type of fighter, behind only the United States. And if we add to this the more than 30 HIMARS systems, or the 12 South Korean Chunmoo systems that the United Arab Emirates have, we could be sure that the Strait of Hormuz could become a theater of explosions. The reality is that the strategy of the Houthis and the Ayatollahs could have a very hard time surviving. In a scenario in which the world's major powers unite to stop them, the Houthis and the Ayatollahs wouldn't have any winning trump card. They don't have a fleet as such, but only armed speedboats and their anti-aircraft defense systems that are rather precarious. This is an advantage that Israel is counting on. They believe that the risk of Iran making a false step can only be to their advantage advantage, because the damage would be limited in time, and international intervention would greatly damage the Ayatollahs. That is partly why the Israeli government is delighted that the pressure continues to grow, and that is also why the Iranian regime seems to have been stymied in recent weeks. No option looks good for Tehran. But of course, let's see who's willing to take such a risk. Netanyahu maybe, but international leaders are not even close. Certain things are not to be trifled with. No doubt, VisualPolitik community, as they say, things could get out of hand. If Iran were to consider Israel's response to be disproportionate, there's a real possibility that it would attempt to implement a total or partial blockade of the Straits. This could not only lead to a tremendous escalation of tensions in the region, but also at the global level. The international response would be overwhelming, enough not only to force them to liberate the Strait of Hormuz, but also to bid farewell to their proxy in Yemen, which would have a much more difficult time withstanding Western onslaughts. At the same time, however, it's certain that oil prices would go through the roof, possibly even triggering a new global recession. And that is provided Iran didn't decide to press the button of assured economic destruction and use its huge arsenal of missiles to attack the oil fields of its Arab neighbors. Fields that are protected, but whose protection would do nothing against a massive rain of missiles. In other words, this whole powder keg is a huge headache with many risks and few potential benefits. And that is why Washington wants Netanyahu to step on the brakes and not respond harshly to Iran. Be that as it may, things are looking worse and worse. A few months ago here on VisualPolitik, we already told you that a military clash with Iran seems to be becoming inevitable. And here we are. VisualPolitik community, only time will tell how Israel will respond and whether Iran will ultimately react by implementing this risky move. Until then, the question is over to you. Do you think Iran would risk an international conflict? Would China take the step to stop it before then? Leave us your thoughts down here in the comments and we'll start a debate. As always, thank you so much for being there. Thanks for watching till the end. All the best. See you next time.
More dollars I need, come again.